Brought to you by Wikivideo Documentaries. East India Company. The East India Company, also known as the Honourable East India Company or the British East India Company and informally as John Company, was an English and later British joint stock company, which was formed to pursue trade with the East Indies, but ended up trading mainly with Qing China and seizing control of the Indian subcontinent. Originally chartered as the Governor and Company of Merchants of London trading into the East Indies, the company rose to account for half of the world's trade, particularly in basic commodities including cotton, silk, indigo dye, salt, saltpeter, tea, and opium. The company also ruled the beginnings of the British Empire in India. The company received a royal charter from Queen Elizabeth I on the 31st of December 1600, making it the oldest among several similarly formed European East India companies. Wealthy merchants and aristocrats owned the company's shares. Initially the government owned no shares and had only indirect control until 1657, when permanent joint stock was established. During its first century of operation, the focus of the company was trade, not the building of an empire in India. Company interests turned from trade to territory during the 18th century as the Mughal Empire declined in power and the East India Company struggled with its French counterpart, the French East India Company, during the Carnatic Wars of the 1740s and 1750s. The battles of Plassey and Bucha, in which the British defeated the Indian powers, left the company in control of Bengal and a major military and political power in India. In the following decades it gradually increased the extent of the territories under its control, ruling the whole Indian subcontinent either directly or indirectly via local puppet rulers under the threat of force by its presidency armies, much of which were composed of native Indian sepoys. By 1803, at the height of its rule in India, the British East India Company had a private army of about 260,000, twice the size of the British Army. The company eventually came to rule large areas of India with its private armies, exercising military power and assuming administrative functions. Company rule in India effectively began in 1757 and lasted until 1858, when, following the Indian Rebellion of 1857, the Government of India Act 1858 led to the British Crown's assuming direct control of the Indian subcontinent in the form of the new British Raj. Despite frequent government intervention, the company had recurring problems with its finances. It was dissolved in 1874 as a result of the East India Stock Dividend Redemption Act passed 1 year earlier, as the Government of India Act had, by then, rendered it vestigial, powerless, and obsolete. The official government machinery of British India had assumed its governmental functions and absorbed its armies. Founding. Soon after the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588, London merchants presented a petition to Queen Elizabeth I for permission to sail to the Indian Ocean. Permission was granted, and on the 10th of April 1591 3 ships sailed from Torbay around the Cape of Good Hope to the Arabian Sea on one of the earliest English overseas Indian expeditions and preyed on Spanish and Portuguese ships. One of them, Edward Bonaventure, then sailed around Cape Comorin to the Malay Peninsula and returned to England in 1594. In 1596, 3 more ships sailed east, but were all lost at sea. 3 years later, on the 22nd of September 1599, another group of merchants met and stated their intention to venture in the pretended voyage to the East Indies, and the sums that they will adventure, committing £30,133. 2 days later, on the 24th of September, the adventurers reconvened and resolved to apply to the Queen for support of the project. Although their first attempt had not been completely successful, they nonetheless sought the Queen's unofficial approval to continue, bought ships for their venture, and increased their capital to £68,373. The adventurers convened again a year later. This time they succeeded, and on the 31st of December 1600, the Queen granted a royal charter to George, Earl of Cumberland, and 215 knights, aldermen, and burgesses, under the name Governor and Company of Merchants of London trading with the East Indies. For a period of 15 years, the charter awarded the newly formed company a monopoly on trade with all countries east of the Cape of Good Hope and west of the Straits of Magellan. Any traders, in breach of the charter without a license from the company, were liable to forfeiture of their ships and cargo, as well as imprisonment at the royal pleasure. The governance of the company was in the hands of one governor and 24 directors or committees, who made up the court of directors. They, in turn, reported to the court of proprietors, which appointed them. 10 committees reported to the court of directors. According to tradition, business was initially transacted at the Nag's Head Inn, opposite St. Botolph's Church and Bishopsgate, before moving to India House in Leadenhall Street. Early voyages to the East Indies. Sir James Lancaster commanded the first East India Company voyage in 1601 aboard the Red Dragon, and set up 2 factories, one at Bantam on Java and another in the Moluccas before leaving. They returned to England in 1603, where Lancaster was knighted by the new King James I. In March 1604, Sir Henry Middleton commanded the second voyage. General William Keeling, a captain during the second voyage, led the third voyage aboard the Red Dragon from 1607 to 1610, along with the Hector under Captain William Hawkins and the Consent under Captain David Middleton. Early in 1608, Alexander Sharpe was appointed captain of the company's Ascension, and general or commander of the fourth voyage. Thereafter 2 ships, Ascension and Union, sailed from Woolwich on 14 March 1607-08. Initially, the company struggled in the spice trade, because of the competition from the already well-established Dutch East India Company. The company opened a factory in Bantam on the first voyage, and imports of pepper from Java comprised an important part of the company's trade for 20 years. The factory in Bantam was closed in 1683. During this time, ships belonging to the company arriving in India docked at Surat, which was established as a trade transit point in 1608. In the next 2 years, the company established its first factory in South India in the town of Machilipatnam on the Coromandel coast of the Bay of Bengal. The high profits reported by the company after landing in India initially prompted James I to grant subsidiary licenses to other trading companies in England. But in 1609 he renewed the charter given to the company for an indefinite period, including a clause that specified that the charter would cease to be in force if the trade turned unprofitable for 3 consecutive years. Foothold in India. English traders frequently engaged in hostilities with their Dutch and Portuguese counterparts in the Indian Ocean. The company achieved a major victory over the Portuguese in the Battle of Swali in 1612, at Suvali and Surat. The company decided to explore the feasibility of gaining a territorial foothold in mainland India, with official sanction from both Britain and the Mughal Empire, and requested that the Crown launch a diplomatic mission. In 1612, James I instructed Sir Thomas Roe to visit the Mughal Emperor Nuruddin Salim Jahangir to arrange for a commercial treaty that would give the company exclusive rights to reside and establish factories in Surat and other areas. In return, the company offered to provide the emperor with goods and rarities from the European market. This mission was highly successful, and Jahangir sent a letter to James through Sir Thomas Roe. Expansion. The company, which benefited from the imperial patronage, soon expanded its commercial trading operations. It eclipsed the Portuguese Estado de India, which had established bases in Goa, Chittagong, and Bombay, which Portugal later ceded to England as part of the dowry of Catherine of Braganza on her marriage to King Charles II. The East India Company also launched a joint attack with the Dutch United East India Company on Portuguese and Spanish ships off the coast of China, which helped secure ports in China. The company established trading posts in Surat, Madras, Bombay, and Calcutta. By 1647, the company had 23 factories, each under the command of a factor or master merchant and governor, and 90 employees in India. The major factories became the walled forts of Fort William in Bengal, Fort St. George in Madras, and Bombay Castle. In 1634, the Mughal emperor extended his hospitality to the English traders to the region of Bengal, and in 1717 completely waived customs duties for their trade. The company's mainstay businesses were by then cotton, silk, indigo dye, saltpeter, and tea. The Dutch were aggressive competitors, and had meanwhile expanded their monopoly of the spice trade in the Straits of Malacca by ousting the Portuguese in 1640-41. With reduced Portuguese and Spanish influence in the region, the Eyak and Vok entered a period of intense competition, resulting in the Anglo-Dutch Wars of the 17th and 18th centuries. Within the first 2 decades of the 17th century, the Dutch East India Company, or Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, was the wealthiest commercial operation in the world, with 50,000 employees worldwide and a private fleet of 200 ships. It specialized in the spice trade and gave its shareholders 40% annual dividend. It controlled half of all trade in Europe. This was a formidable adversary for the British East India Company, which also wanted to trade in spices by breaking into the Dutch monopoly. The British East India Company was fiercely competitive with the Dutch and French throughout the 17th and 18th centuries over spices from the Spice Islands. Spices, at the time, could only be found on these islands, such as pepper, ginger, nutmeg, cloves, and cinnamon, could bring profits as high as 400% from one voyage. The Dutch and the English vied for the same spices on the same small Maluku Islands. They didn't trust each other, as they built fortifications near each other and looked for anything suspicious. The Dutch found some suspicious English near the Dutch fort, arrested them, tortured an improbable confession out of them, and executed them. This became known as the Amboina Massacre. British citizens were outraged at the news of their countrymen being tortured by the cruel Dutch. Media at the time inflamed passions and exaggerated the facts. Soon the Dutch had a reputation associated with anything bad Dutch uncle, going Dutch. The tension was so high between the Dutch and the British East Indies trading companies that it escalated into at least 4 Anglo-Dutch wars between them: 1652, 1654, 1665, 1667, 1672, 1674, and 1780, 1784. The Dutch company maintained that profit must support the cost of war, which came from trade which produced profit. War and trade are part of doing good business. Competition arose in 1635 when Charles I granted a trading license to Sir William Courtine, which permitted the rival Courtine Association to trade with the East at any location in which the Eyak had no presence. In 1657, Oliver Cromwell renewed the Charter of 1609, and brought about minor changes in the holding of the company. The restoration of monarchy in England further enhanced the Eyak's status. In an act aimed at strengthening the power of the Eyak, King Charles II granted the Eyak the rights to autonomous territorial acquisitions, to mint money, to command fortresses and troops, and form alliances, to make war and peace, and to exercise both civil and criminal jurisdiction over the acquired areas. William Hedges was sent in 1682 to Shaista Khan, the Mughal governor of Bengal, to obtain a firman, an imperial directive that would grant England regular trading privileges throughout the Mughal Empire. However, the company's governor in London, Sir Josiah Child, interfered with Hedges' mission, causing Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb to break off the negotiations. In 1689, a Mughal fleet commanded by Sidi Yaqub attacked Bombay. After a year of resistance, the Eyak surrendered in 1690, and the company sent envoys to Aurangzeb's camp to plead for a pardon. The company's envoys had to prostrate themselves before the emperor, pay a large indemnity, and promise better behavior in the future. The emperor withdrew his troops, and the company subsequently re-established itself in Bombay and set up a new base in Calcutta. Eventually, the East India Company seized control of Bengal and slowly the whole Indian subcontinent with its private armies, composed primarily of Indian sepoys. As historian William Dalrymple observes, Mughal convoy piracy incident of 1695. In September 1695, Captain Henry Every, an English pirate on board the Fancy, reached the Straits of Bab el-Mandeb, where he teamed up with 5 other pirate captains to make an attack on the Indian fleet on return from the annual pilgrimage to Mecca. The Mughal convoy included the treasure-laden Ganj-i Sawai, reported to be the greatest in the Mughal fleet and the largest ship operational in the Indian Ocean, and its escort, the Fateh Muhammad. They were spotted passing the straits en route to Surat. The pirates gave chase and caught up with Fateh Muhammad some days later, and meeting little resistance, took some £50,000 to £60,000 worth of treasure. Every continued in pursuit and managed to overhaul Ganj-i Sawai, which resisted strongly before eventually striking. Ganj Isawai carried enormous wealth and, according to contemporary East India Company sources, was carrying a relative of the Grand Mughal, though there is no evidence to suggest that it was his daughter and her retinue. The loot from the Ganj Isawai had a total value between £325,000 and £600,000, including 500,000 gold and silver pieces, and has become known as the richest ship ever taken by pirates. In a letter sent to the Privy Council by Sir John Gaya, then Governor of Bombay and head of the East India Company, Gaya claims that it is certain the pirates did do very barbarously by the people of the Ganj Isawai and Abdul Ghafar's ship, to make them confess where their money was. The pirates set free the survivors who were left aboard their emptied ships, to continue their voyage back to India. When the news arrived in England, it caused an outcry. To appease Aurangzeb, the East India Company promised to pay all financial reparations, while Parliament declared the pirates' host as humanely generous. In mid-1696 the government issued a £500 bounty on every's head, and offered a free pardon to any informer who disclosed his whereabouts. When the East India Company later doubled that reward, the first worldwide manhunt in recorded history was underway. The plunder of Aurangzeb's treasure ship had serious consequences for the English East India Company. The furious Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb ordered Sidi Yaqub and Nawab Daud Khan to attack and close 4 of the company's factories in India and imprison their officers, who were almost lynched by a mob of angry Mughals, blaming them for their countrymen's depredations, and threatened to put an end to all English trading in India. To appease Emperor Aurangzeb, and particularly his Grand Vizier Azad Khan, Parliament exempted every from all of the acts of grace and amnesties it would subsequently issue to other pirates. Trade monopoly. The prosperity that the officers of the company enjoyed allowed them to return to Britain and establish sprawling estates and businesses, and, to obtain political power, the company developed a lobby in the English Parliament. Under pressure from ambitious tradesmen and former associates of the company, who wanted to establish private trading firms in India, a deregulating act was passed in 1694. This allowed any English firm to trade with India, unless specifically prohibited by Act of Parliament, thereby annulling the charter that had been in force for almost 100 years. By an act that was passed in 1698, a new, parallel, East India Company was floated under a state-backed indemnity of £2 million. The powerful stockholders of the old company quickly subscribed a sum of £315,000 in the new concern, and dominated the new body. The two companies wrestled with each other for some time, both in England and in India, for a dominant share of the trade. It quickly became evident that, in practice, the original company faced scarcely any measurable competition. The companies merged in 1708, by a tripartite indenture involving both companies and the state. Under this arrangement, the merged company lent to the Treasury a sum of £3,200,000, in return for exclusive privileges for the next 3 years, after which the situation was to be reviewed. The amalgamated company became the United Company of Merchants of England trading to the East Indies. In the following decades there was a constant battle between the company lobby and the Parliament. The company sought a permanent establishment, while the Parliament would not willingly allow it greater autonomy and so relinquish the opportunity to exploit the company's profits. In 1712, another act renewed the status of the company, though the debts were repaid. By 1720, 15% of British imports were from India, almost all passing through the company, which reasserted the influence of the company lobby. The license was prolonged until 1766 by yet another act in 1730. At this time, Britain and France became bitter rivals. Frequent skirmishes between them took place for control of colonial possessions. In 1742, fearing the monetary consequences of a war, the British government agreed to extend the deadline for the licensed exclusive trade by the company in India until 1783, in return for a further loan of £1 million. Between 1756 and 1763, the 7 Years' War diverted the state's attention towards consolidation and defense of its territorial possessions in Europe and its colonies in North America. The war took place on Indian soil, between the company troops and the French forces. In 1757, The law officers of the Crown delivered the Pratt-York opinion distinguishing overseas territories acquired by right of conquest from those acquired by private treaty. The opinion asserted that, while the Crown of Great Britain enjoyed sovereignty over both, only the property of the former was vested in the Crown. With the advent of the Industrial Revolution, Britain surged ahead of its European rivals. Demand for Indian commodities was boosted by the need to sustain the troops and the economy during the war, and by the increased availability of raw materials and efficient methods of production. As home to the Revolution, Britain experienced higher standards of living. Its spiraling cycle of prosperity, demand, and production had a profound influence on overseas trade. The company became the single largest player in the British global market. William Henry Pine notes in his book The Microcosm of London that, on the 1st of March 1801, the debts of the East India Company to £5,393,989, their effects to £15,404,736, and their sales increased since February 1793, from £4,988,300 to £7,602,041. Brought to you by Wikividi Documentaries. Would you like to know more?